So for patients diagnosed with metastatic lung cancer, when we find that the tumor has an EGFR mutation, it gives us a lot of treatment options that we wouldn't have otherwise. And finding the EGFR mutation is quite common in Asia and also in places where there aren't as many people smoking, so in California. So I have a high percentage of patients with EGFR mutations, just as there are in many parts of Asia. And when we're trying to decide what do we do to treat them, we know that starting them on an EGFR drug versus starting with chemotherapy when they have metastatic disease is the right choice. But there are a lot of ways to pick which drug should we use. And so when we think about availability in the US for first and second generation drugs, we have erlotinib, gefitinib, and afatinib. And then in China, of course, there's also icatibant. And so in trying to figure out which of those is best, there are a lot of things that go into that decision. One is going to be availability, cost to the patient, toxicity, where they're all pretty well tolerated. There's some minor differences. And then effectiveness. And between those four, we don't have a lot of data to tell us the one is better than another. There is a comparison of gefitinib versus afatinib, where the afatinib had a slightly better response and time the patient stayed on, but it didn't really change the survival, and so it hasn't changed the practice very much. Now, though, we have confusion with the third generation drug, osimertinib. There was recently a study for first-line osimertinib comparing it to gefitinib or erlotinib, and in that study, it showed a clear improvement in progression-free survival. And there's a trend that maybe there's a survival benefit as well. And so now in the US, we're starting to switch towards using the osimertinib. But I don't think it's a straightforward decision. And if the drug is not available to a patient, I wouldn't look at it as at this point, being a huge detriment to the patient, because if they start on one of the drugs that is available, first or second generation drug, and that helps them for a period of time, they then could be able to switch over to a third generation drug when that becomes available. And if you look at how that impacts survival, it doesn't necessarily make a big difference. In the US, where we do have that, we're debating the use of osimertinib more and starting to think about using it. But I think there's still room for patients starting on an earlier first or second generation drug and later switching, because you have to take into account the whole, a lot of different aspects. It's not just about slight differences in progression-free survival. It's about availability, it's about tolerability, it's about cost, and I think all of those need to be taken into account when we're thinking about how do we best help each patient live as well as they can, as long as they can. So the checkpoint inhibitor drugs have certainly been a very exciting revolution for lung cancer treatment over the last few years. So the drugs that inhibit PD-1 and PD-L1 now have just been something we've known about for a few years. And we know that for patients who've had first-line chemotherapy and now we're looking at second-line treatments, there are a lot of studies showing that the checkpoint inhibitor drugs are better than single-agent chemo. However, in the patients who have EGFR mutations, which is a high percentage of patients in many parts of the world, that story is not as clear. Those patients did not seem to benefit quite as much, and so there's a lot we still don't understand about the checkpoint drugs. We now also have data for first-line for patients who do not have EGFR, do not have ALK, who have high PD-L1 expression. There was a study looking at pembrolizumab versus first-line chemotherapy, showing that the pembrolizumab was better for those patients and led to not just better response, but also better overall survival. So for patients where they're living in a country where they do have access to a checkpoint inhibitor drug, if they have the high expression and they don't have EGFR or ALK, that's a very good choice, and that is something that we're doing in the United States. But for patients that have EGFR mutations or ALK mutations or other drivers, we don't know as much about what to do for them. And we're tending to kind of focus on the driver mutation, then try chemo, and then try the checkpoint drugs with ongoing trials to help us learn even more. So in talking more about the checkpoint inhibitors, I think it's important to emphasize that those drugs are not yet helping all patients. There's a lot of enthusiasm for them, and sometimes that exceeds the expectations from the patients, exceeds what we're actually able to see with the drugs, and that can be a challenging discussion, but it's also something we need to keep in mind. There are a lot of patients, I think, who feel that if they don't get a checkpoint inhibitor drug, they're somehow not going to have the best possible outcomes, and that's not always true. And so it's an important message as we start learning more and more about how to use them. When we're talking about treating lung cancer, we have to think about how do we fund the research, how do we keep things moving forward, and there are a lot of different ways of supporting that. Grants are available for people to do specific research. A lot of that's laboratory research, the true discovery. Some of it's to support some of the clinical trials, but a lot of the time those are partnerships to be able to get the studies done, because it's such a big and complex process to do a clinical trial. So it's very, very rare that an investigator or a team of investigators can really do that on their own. There's often going to be the whole business world involved as well, because they're going to be pharmaceutical companies developing a compound that have backing, or they're looking at that from an investment standpoint. And then the scientists and physicians and patients looking at it from how do we move it forward to really truly help people. And that kind of a partnership is how we really move forward with research. For getting grants for those early sort of discovery, it's very different around the world as far as government funding, pharmaceutical company funding, philanthropy funding, and so it just comes down to where someone's living and working and then applying and applying and applying, because it's very hard to get these. It's very competitive, and the people who succeed are the ones who just keep going and trying and trying.